Crunch time.
Thank you. Yeah, this is AP US Government Review. This is crunch time. This is not my PowerPoint. I stole it from the internet, and I'm going to put it on YouTube with my voice attached to it. Here we go.
You do not want us to talk.
You can talk if you really have to, because this is just for your fellow students. If somebody else wanders in and watches it, well, you get what you pay for. It's free. All right. So constitutional underpinnings will be about roughly 10%, including federalism. And political beliefs and behavior will be roughly 15%. Political parties, interest groups, the mass media, that'll be another about 15%. Institutions will be about 40%. And on the AP released exam we just did, there are 60 questions and there are 24 questions about institutions. So you do the math. Public policy, 10%. Civil rights and civil liberties, 10%. So, that 60% that we didn't do so hot on is what we're going to try to put the most time into. So we're going to zip through constitutional underpinnings and political beliefs and behavior, and then when we get to political parties and that stuff, we'll slow down. If you need to leave before I'm finished, go. We started when we started, and we're going to finish when you all leave me, or I can't do it anymore. One or the other.
24-hour study session. Let's go.
Hey, if you want to go out once in a while and get food, I'm there. Maybe, unless I collapse or lose my voice. All right, 60 multiple choice questions, half of the total score. You have 45 minutes. Everybody did real well on that this time who took it because I was mean about it a little bit. And I said, hey, you should have half of them done now. And that kind of thing. But you're not going to have that. All you're going to have is someone saying, if they remember, 5 minutes left. So you're going to have to have a clock handy and look at it and manage your time. Notice when it started. Maybe make a little mark about 20 minutes after that to know that you kind of need to be close to half done at that time, and move on. And when there's just 5 minutes left, well, 45 minutes. That means that you should have 10% of it left. You should be in the 50s, right? Once they say 5 minutes, if you're on 34, ouch. That's spooky and scary. Don't do that. Essays, 4 free response questions in 100 minutes. Like I said, you can go to AP Central and look at more. We did some. You can look at more. It's an excellent way to review content is to just look at those rubrics and see what would answer the free response questions. And for some strange reason, they do a real good job of explaining it with very few words. I kind of wish that I had had the time to go through there and steal that and put it in an outline, some sort of outline form. Each essay is worth 1/8 of your total score. Okay? So 1/8. And if one essay has 5 points to score it, and one essay has 7 points to score it, it doesn't matter as far as their total share. They're both worth the same amount. Which means the one with fewer points, each of those points is more valuable. Okay? If all you can do is identify and explain one thing on a free response question, that's still probably going to be at least 30 or 40% of the points available on that free response question. Okay? So if all you can do is do that first step, which is almost always defining something, that's still going to be a significant number of points. That's still worth a lot more than an individual multiple choice question. Don't give up on defining those things, even if you look at the rest and go, oh man, for some reason I just don't know this one. You probably can define the stuff. Maybe give an example. Even if it's just something that you had the flu when we went over and you didn't catch up in the reading. Okay, combined total for the free response questions, 50%. Remember, block them out. When you do the A part, write your A part and then skip a couple of lines just in case you come up with something else to put on A, and then do B, and then block it out. But don't label. If you accidentally stumble onto the right answer in a different part of your answer than where it should go, if you labeled, you'll get the points for it. But if you label and it's in the wrong place, they'll know that you didn't really know what you were talking about, and then they won't give you the point. Essays can cover either separate components outlined previously or combine elements or factors discussed in Part A. See adjoining sheet for possible themes or subject matter. We don't have an adjoining sheet, dude. You put this on the interwebs. Okay. Well, we're just going to zip through this slide here. We get the idea. Like I said, this guy has a little personality here. And if it is to be, it is up to me. And by that, you're supposed to say that and internalize that it's up to you. not taking the exam for you, so that's against the law for one thing. And they are prosecuting teachers for cheating nowadays. So over in Atlanta, you know, and they put those people on huge bail amounts. You know, you got mass murderers who are having to pay like $80,000 bail, and they've got millions of dollars for bail for teachers who cheated on an exam. I'm not sure why, but that's what they did. So here we go, constitutional underpinnings. What is the purpose of politics? A conflicting state where one selects leaders. Leaders work within institutions to make policy. All right, so define democracy. What do you think democracy is?
Everybody gets equal representation or votes or something like that.
Democracy, select and formulate policy representing and responding to public preferences, the preferences of the people. All right? That's kind of a modern definition of democracy. You know, the most basic definition of democracy is everybody who's a citizen votes. There are 5 elements. And here we go. Theories encompassing 5 elements of democracy. Equality in voting. You know, that goes like Westbury versus Saunders, one man, one vote, which nowadays we say one person, one vote, but when that court case was done, we use man, gender, neutral. You know, so. And I like to do it still because I'm old and because it's 1 syllable and person is 2. All right, effective participation. You have to be able to participate effectively. Enlightened understanding. A plethora of ideas. There has to be free exchange of ideas. And people have to actually consider those ideas. If the citizenry fail to achieve some sort of enlightened understanding, then democracy is sort of a sham. In other words, people are being fooled into the decisions they're making. They're not putting the effort into learning and understanding, and they just vote the way a demagogue says to vote. Some leader person. Somebody like, I don't know, someone on Fox News or MSNBC News, where these people just tell the people who watch them what to think. Which is what they already thought anyway, because probably daddy or mommy thought that way. Citizen control of the agenda. Regular folks have to be able to put issues into consideration. Inclusion of all who are willing to participate. If you want to be involved, you can participate. One of the concerns a lot of people have nowadays is how hard they're making it for third-party candidates to get on ballots. All right, so that's a concern. Just how many people should sign a petition before you get your name on a ballot to be considered for office. So effective participation, you know, can you become involved in a political party? Can you volunteer? If you do, will you be penalized in some way? Or penalized? So this is an issue. This is something to be concerned about. You know, one of the issues here, free speech and property rights and such, because one of the things going on right now is there have been some cases of people getting fired for having different political views and telling people what their political views are on Facebook, different political views than their boss. So that's a concern. Where do you set a limit to how much right, what kind of right an employer has, you know, to kind of define their business and the rights of a citizen to express their political views? How does that work? Because obviously, you can see where in some cases it makes sense that the employer probably should have a little bit of control over that. Say, if you've got someone working for your party campaign, your campaign for you to run for office, and they're talking very differently than you do about your campaign's platform, and they have a very different position, that's going to be a little awkward, to say the least. So it's not cut and dried where everybody's going, well, we don't want bosses, you know, oppressing everyone. You know, so it's tricky. All right, so there should be in a democracy majority rule with minority rights. So this is an issue of power. Who holds power? What is a majority? A majority is an accumulation, at least in our country, because we are heterogeneous, not homogeneous. We have many different ethnic groups and religions and so on. An accumulation of minorities. So who really governs? In pluralist theory, there's competition among groups. In elite and class theory, class splits, big business rules, or the bureaucracy rules, some sort of elite rules. And hyperpluralism argues basically that there is competition among groups, and it leads to very little to gain from. Groups divide government, making it ineffective. Pluralists argue that compromise is reached, and hyperpluralists argue that gridlock is reached. So they're really kind of working off the same basic assumption and saying it leads to a different result than one another. And of course, my theory is they're all right some of the time. Okay, political theorists represent theories. We did not talk about Hume. I don't know who this guy is, but he's obviously kicks it up a notch because Hume is very unlikely to show up on an AP exam. So we'll move on. Hobbes, he's the guy who believed in a social contract theory that said that lack of government, anarchy, was so bad that even if you have a tyrant, that's okay. It's better than the alternative, so everybody should buckle under and do what they're supposed to. And that the contract you sign to get order means that you give up an awful lot of freedom to the person at the top to avoid basically something that looks a lot like zombie apocalypse. And of course, his ideas are informed by his experience with the English Civil War, where a lot of ridiculously insane violence happened, and very little seemed to be gained out of all of it. Locke comes along 40 years later or so, and he has a much more positive view of rebellions because the revolution the glorious revolution he saw, it's called glorious because not many people died, and he argued that you do get into a contract with a government in order to protect your liberties, but there's a limit to how much they can restrain your freedoms to create a positive form of liberty. And if they go past that, then they broke the contract, and you get to do what you get to do with any contract somebody breaks, which is you get to ignore it. So you get to ignore that government and establish a new one. And he argues that it's possible, and that when you get rid of one government, people are rational and they're able to do it without it being spiraling into some sort of crazy, horrible thing. Rousseau, he believes in a complete democracy ruled by all. He also believes in something called the general will. He has a much stronger view of majority rights than do most of these guys. Okay, so here you go. Rousseau, a form of direct democracy. Hume wants lots of people involved. Locke he's kind of got an elitist, constitutional monarchy, republic kind of view. You know, early on in the revolution, the people who talked about republic were elitist. And not a whole lot of people were bringing up the word democracy in a good way. All right, the above is a political spectrum. When one governs, one seeks power, and the ability to persuade someone else that is in their interest to follow you, that is power. Getting other people to do what you want. I like my definition better, getting them to do what you want. Power can be distributed three ways in a democracy, and we've just basically kind of talked about that. You have the power elite of a representative democracy, the political elite of a participatory democracy, majoritarian rule, which is direct democracy. He's going into a lot more detail than really is necessary for the AP exam. And since we're doing a review, we're not going to go into it in detail. Mob rule, Rousseau. Well, that's the way other people who don't like Rousseau's ideas would view it as a mob rule. But Rousseau's kind of got a utopian notion of what will happen. So what does one do with power? You make policy. And policy is anything the government chooses to do, and sometimes is what it chooses not to do. Like, for example, when it chose not to enforce the 15th Amendment and come up with ways to get around enforcing the 15th Amendment for 100 years, that was a policy decision. Articles of Confederation. What could it do, and worse, what couldn't it do? What showed is the Articles in Confederation true weaknesses. What shows these weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation was Shays' Rebellion. So the Second Constitution comes along, and I really don't know what this guy is meaning by equality here, but what I'm going to say is wow, that to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I'm sure it makes sense how he strings it together, but I would argue, there was more equality between the states under the Articles of Confederation. If you're talking about equality of individuals, well, that's debatable. If he's arguing there's more individual equality under the Second Constitution. Representation is established by what type of government? A Republican government. Now, a republic doesn't necessarily have to have a representation based on people voting for other people, or based on lots of people voting for other people. In fact, the earliest form of republic we had, only a very small number of the population got to pick the representatives. All right, so representation was a key issue on the Constitution. The New Jersey Plan offered what? They wanted each state to have an equal number of representatives. Virginia Plan wanted it based on population. Why? Because New Jersey was a small state, Virginia was a big state. What this leads to is the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, or as I like to think of it when I'm studying and worried about it in a test, the Great/Connecticut Compromise. And I actually think about it, Great/Connecticut Compromise. All right? And what did it do? It used the fact, England already had a bicameral tradition. House of Commons, House of Lords. This was not some earth-shaking concept. It had been used before in the colonies. So the idea of having a bicameral legislature with a Senate and a House of Representatives wasn't that bizarre, but it was definitely very useful to get the small states and the big states to agree to the Constitution. Because you give the big states what they want in the House, and you give the little states what they want in the Senate. Slavery. The South wanted all males counted, and for purposes of representation in the House. So the North said that's ridiculous. You're treating those people like property, not like citizens, and yet you want them to count for representation in Congress. That doesn't make any sense. So they come up with something that basically doesn't make any sense either, but keeps both of them semi-okay with things, which is the 3/5 compromise. It's just as illogical as the argument the South was making. But it's what the North did, basically, so that the South would not be a different country. Who can vote? Property owners versus the disenfranchised. Originally, it was property owners who could vote. Who controlled elections? States set election laws. Why? Because they couldn't agree on how to do it in the Constitution, in the Constitutional Convention. They just couldn't figure that out, so they just said, okay, we'll leave it to the states. Who will control the economy? Congress will make decisions about interstate commerce. And it will deal with things like the infrastructure, post offices, taxation, in Article 1. If you've got the time and you feel like reading the Constitution, if you don't read any other part of the Constitution, you know, besides the amendments, which you've already kind of studied a lot lately, you know, reading all those itemized powers that Congress has wouldn't hurt. Individual rights. Constitution lacked this. And this disturbed people who were concerned that the Constitution was some sneaky way for a king to pop up in the future. There were some individual rights mentioned in the Constitution, besides some real fundamental ones that we're all familiar with. The writ of habeas corpus, so you know why you're in jail. The bill of attainder, which no bill of attainder, which is when Congress votes to make you guilty of a crime. And Congress can't do that. And that's why some of you are looking at me like, what? But Parliament in England had a history in the past of doing just that. So that's why they had that in there. Because the plan is an answer to things that they were scared of, not only in some sort of hypothetical kind of situation, but also things that they were scared of that actually had been done in England at one time or another. Ex post facto laws. If you did something and it was legal and then they made a law against it and you didn't do it once the law was made, you're not guilty of a crime. That's like the case of the lady down in Florida who didn't report her daughter missing because she probably killed her daughter. And, for over a month. And finally the grandparents are like, hey, where's my grandchild? They call the cops. And very famous case. Anybody remember her name?
Over.
Casey Anthony, yeah. Okay. It's now a law that you have to report your kids missing. Okay? So if she did that again, she might get away with it again. But they would put her away for not reporting the missing child. Religious preferences to hold office. You can't require someone to be of a certain religion in order to hold office. And if you took my AP European History class, you might remember the Test Act and all that stuff going on during the English Civil War, and about how Catholics were not allowed to have political office in England at a certain point. Okay, if you didn't take my AP European History class and you know about that, good for you. That's awesome.
What if we did take your AP European History class and we still don't know that?
Shame on you, because I went on and on about it.
Good thing we
I don't remember either.
Treasonous offenses. It details what exactly treason is. Okay, well, not exactly, but enough to where it's not easy to declare someone guilty of treason just because they don't agree with you. So, whenever someone on Fox News calls someone a traitor, they don't get to actually have them charged with treason. I would say MSNBC too, but I don't know of MSNBC doing that. They probably do it once in a while too, but I know Fox does it on occasion. Accuses someone of being people on Fox that they interview. There's that blonde lady who thinks she's pretty, but I don't think she is, who writes all these books all the time. I don't know if you know who I'm talking about, but she says some just awfully mean, nasty things sometimes. And she accuses people of being traitors a lot. Trial by jury. They guaranteed a trial by jury. Wow. Okay, so there's a little bit of stuff that looks like it matches up well with things that you see in the Bill of Rights. That's just kind of snuck in there, hidden away in the Constitution. Okay, so are we being ruled by men or by laws to protect us from these men? We wanted what? We wanted a Bill of Rights, and it's another thing that we knew of because it had been done in England. Not as well as we did it because we're awesome, but they had something called the English Bill of Rights, or what they call the Bill of Rights. Okay? So, and even the Petition of Right before that was kind of another Bill of Rights. Okay? So they had a series of declarations going back at least to the Magna Carta, but frankly the Magna Carta was just restating old feudal rights that the kings were challenging. So it goes back to the very essence of feudalism. In a lot of ways, modern democracy, and I can't waste time with it too much, is just an extension of the ideas of a bunch of Germans who lived in a feudal culture. Ooh. And you thought it was all about Greece and Rome. It has a lot to do with smelly Germans running around in the Dark Ages. No. That's after. Popular sovereignty, what is it? Don't confuse Germans with Nazis. They don't like it. They're very sensitive about that, and I would be too. Just like I don't want to be confused with General Custer.
Like, nobody,
Slaughtered Native Americans until they slaughtered him back. All right. Little Bighorn.
Custer's Revenge. Not much of that.
I believe they talked about that in Iron Man 3, didn't they?
Which one? Custer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Custer slaughtering children and women. All right. See, you can learn stuff from movies if you pay attention. Well, usually you have to know about it already for you to notice it. All right, here we go. Popular sovereignty, what is it? The ability to control one's destiny is his answer. The normal destiny is the people. The normal definition is the people rule. Checks and balances, what is it? Each branch oversees the other. I very much encourage you to research checks and balances on the internet or in your textbook, or both, because there were a number of questions on the last released exam we took that had to deal with checks and balances, and you guys were not solid on it. And it's one thing that's really easy to study for if you go start staring at the chart. Okay? Because basically it's like this. The Supreme Court's got one, judicial review. The President's got a few little bags of tricks, and then Congress has this huge long list of things it can do to the other branches. All right? Okay? So if you look at that, but the huge long list is stuff you kind of know already. Well, you do. You should kind of know. I taught about it. But it's really not hard to remember. It's stuff you've been hearing about for years. You just haven't put them all together as a category checks. Okay? Except for the real basic one, veto. That's what everybody wants to talk about is veto. And that's great on free response questions. If they want you to give an example of a check to the power of another branch of government, go for it if it applies. Because veto, everybody understands what a veto is. But you got to know the others too, because they ask about them. They were asking kind of in-depth questions, definitely about the executive branch. They weren't just asking the real basic stuff like 4-year terms and stuff like that. And I told you they would. They're not going to just go there. Okay. So each branch oversees the other in checks and balances. They check each other, make sure that they don't just take over. There's separation of powers. Who wrote the doctrine of separation of powers and explicitly explained how checks and balances would make separation of powers work? He was a French guy who was impressed by English government. Montesquieu, the spirit of the laws, absolutely. Okay? Because France was not working. And England seemed to be working from his perspective. So, of course, a lot of Englishmen at the time would have been like, no, England's not working. But the grass is always greener, right? So, but in this case, the grass was greener in England. Just was. France was a mess. So Montesquieu is writing this book about, man, we should be more like England. Okay. Each branch has a certain function. And it says, what was the purpose of the B of R? I assume Bill of Rights. What was the purpose of the Bill of Rights? Do you guys think? You have an idea? What?
Provide rights.
Provide rights which limit the power of what to exercise power over you?
national government.
Yes. To limit the power of the federal government to exercise power over you. That's what an explanation of individual rights is. Absolutely. Too bad the people who are watching this on YouTube later will not see my hands moving around and my emphatic gestures. And my silly gestures too. All right. Okay. So, Bill of Rights has something intrinsically to do with limited government, which is a very key thing to understand about the Constitution. Huge goal of the Constitution was limited government. Huge goal of the Articles of Confederation was limited government, and they succeeded too much. It was too limited. So the whole purpose of the Constitution was to create a limited government that could get things done. Ratification. States had to vote. How many states needed to ratify? You guys remember? 9. Okay. Now they ended up getting everybody to ratify it later, but they waited to actually enact it. They didn't just start going with the Constitution once they got to 9, because there were 2 states that hadn't ratified it yet. Okay, you guys remember what they were? That they said, okay, we've got 9, but we still want these guys in. New York and... No, they waited a long time. Was it Virginia? Virginia? Okay. But here's the important thing. Out of those 2 states, New York's the one to key in on. Because that's the one that the Federalist Papers are written about. So Federalist versus Anti-Federalist. So the issue, the second Constitution was a class-based document that benefited only the economic elite. That's what Charles Beard says. Or was it fundamental liberties? Were the Bill of Rights enough? Federal money diminishes state money. Oh, yeah. If the federal government has more money to spend, then it will exercise more power. Which goes, if you look at American history, that is very true. Extremely true. Because what have we seen the federal government do as it has more money to spend? If it has more money to spend than it can use for things that it absolutely has the right to do under the Constitution, the power to do, it can use that money to influence how the states do things. A lot of the power the federal government has now is basically, you either do it our way, states, or we don't give you the money. So, who ratified the Constitution? State special conventions would ratify. State legislators or legislatures. The amendment process. There's a formal process. It takes 2 steps. You have the proposal, and you have the 2/3 vote at the national level. And it's either going to be in Congress or in a national convention. And a national convention would be basically just another convention like the Philadelphia Convention, which is the Constitutional Convention. It literally would be delegates from every state. Okay? And remember what happened the last time we did that? They went in to revise the Articles of Confederation, they scrapped it and wrote a whole new Constitution. So in theory, if we had another national convention, they might just surprise us with something else than what we sent them in there for. All right? The 2/3 vote of each Congress, so bicameralism, which is a check and balance between an internal check of the power of the Congress, right, is applies to amendments as well. But 2/3, the way to remember this is it's 2/3, it's national, is how it starts, the proposal. And then ratification is 3/4, and it happens at the state level. And at the national level and the state level, it can be handled either by the legislature or it can be handled by conventions. So it's either going to be a national legislature or a national convention to propose, and then it will be either a state legislature or a state convention to ratify, and the numbers go 2/3, 3/4, which are kind of numerically in progression. So it should be easy to kind of remember that. Okay? So you can just make this little box chart, right? And make that all make sense. 27 amendments have been passed, everything from taxation to congressional salaries. There's an informal process in which we have our understanding of the Constitution can change without it being a formal amendment. Federal court decisions, like Marbury versus Madison. Judicial review is not in the Constitution, but it's considered constitutional. Changing political practices, Democrats versus Republicans, how they do things. Eventually it just becomes sort of a de facto tradition that nobody ever breaks. Liberal policy versus conservative. Domestic politics to foreign politics. Policymakers carry big sticks in implementing. This is a different thought. He didn't go into all the informal processes. Presidential traditions. For a while, we had an informal amendment that you serve 2 terms, and only 2 terms. Washington established that tradition, and people observed it until something really weird happened. A depression like no other, and a war like no other. And that kind of created a situation where the president in office decided to ignore tradition. And so that informal amendment was informally amended. And later, because the rival party, the Republicans, did not like the experience of having all those Democratic elections, presidential elections, victories, they decided to set a 2-term limit, which they regretted greatly when Reagan served his 2 terms and couldn't run for a 3rd. All right? And then, of course, Democrats started rethinking it when Bill Clinton served his 2 terms. Okay, so I got into a little more detail than the slide did, so now we'll move on. Domestic politics to foreign politics. No. Okay, so I'll just have to talk with a blank slide on this issue. All right. 3 categories of powers based on how the federal government and the state government share them. All right? If it's powers they both have, they're concurrent powers.
Concurrent.
Yes. And if they are powers only the federal government has, those are exclusive powers. If they're powers only the state has, those are reserve powers. That's in an amendment in the Bill of Rights even. All right? Now, when you're defining the powers the federal government has, this is the way I understand it. I don't know what that guy was doing with that slide, but to me, this is how to explain it, which is the powers of the federal government are divided between 3 categories, and this showed up on the released exam and hurt us. Inherent powers are powers that are not written in the Constitution and not even implied by things written in the Constitution. They're assumed to exist. So the classic examples of inherent powers are the power for a nation to define its own territory. All right? So it's power to determine its territory and also citizenship. There's nothing in the Constitution talking about citizenship other than in terms of who can hold office as president. Beyond that, there's really no mention of citizenship. It's assumed every government decides who their citizens are. All right? So it's really important to remember, the definition of inherent powers is things that every sovereign government has to have. Territory, people. Right? And that means it defines citizenship. And the example that was in an exam, and the example that is easiest to understand, and it goes straight to a quandary Thomas Jefferson had, because Thomas Jefferson argued for one type of power, express power. He argued that the delegated powers, the powers explicitly enumerated, written down in the Constitution, were the only powers the federal government had. And this caused him a problem when Napoleon decided to sell Louisiana Territory, because there was nothing in the Constitution said that the federal government could buy that land. And that's when Thomas Jefferson basically went back and said, okay, I'm going to revise my opinion because this is too good to pass up. And we're just going to assume any sovereign government can buy land. And they bought the Louisiana Purchase. That is an example of an inherent power. There's nothing in the Constitution that expressly states or implies that we can buy huge tracts of land from other countries. And that made me think of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Now, express powers, those are the things literally written down. The commerce power is written down in the Constitution, that the legislature has the power to regulate interstate commerce. That is the commerce power. Implied powers are things that are not in the Constitution, but you have the power to do them in order to carry out the ones that are written down. So, and there's a clause, the necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause in the Constitution, that says that the government and Congress has the power to make laws, Congress has the power to make laws necessary and proper to carry out these powers. So they literally say with the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause that Congress has the power to make necessary and proper laws to carry out its commerce power. And that's how the decision was made on banking. That we could have a national bank, because that is a way that Congress could carry out its interstate commerce power. Okay? So, inherent powers assumed to exist, didn't even have to bother to write them down, they're self-evident. We hold these powers of government to be self-evident. That never showed up in a document, but it sounds like one, doesn't it? Express powers, they're written down. They're also known as delegated or enumerated powers. And in implied powers, you have the elastic clause, which allows you to have implied powers, which are things that aren't written down, but they're allowed because they allow you to use your express powers to get something done. But they're implied. They're not something that you can just, you're not supposed to be a weasel and come up with some way to justify anything. Important. Implied powers doesn't mean that you can just say anything goes. You have to really make a logical argument. Define a decentralization of government, a sharing of the wealth and government power. Delegated powers belong to the, hey, there it is again. And he's talking about inherent powers. All government possess these powers. Immigration, express powers, enumerated or delegated. Stated specifically, Congress makes laws. Implied powers makes express powers work. Congress establishes a civil service system to hire federal workers. Concurrent powers are powers. Now, see, what he's talking about, he was talking about all those federal powers and the categories. Those all are lumped together in the textbooks I've taught out as exclusive powers. So, the federal government's exclusive powers are inherent, implied, expressed. I put those in the wrong order, but you get the idea. However, they have concurrent powers, which are also inherent, expressed, and implied, right? So I don't like his division there. Because these are different, this is like in a table where you have a category over here and you have categories over there, right? And some of them intersect and some of them don't. Okay, if that makes any sense. So shared powers, these are powers that both the state government and the federal government have. What the heck is beeping? Is somebody's phone beeping?
No, it's not people.
Okay, I heard a beep. It's okay, I just want to know if something's going wrong with my computer. But I'm charged. Okay. Here we go. So you have state laws about education, you have state laws about taxation, you have state laws about safety, but you also have federal laws about education, federal laws about taxation, federal laws about safety. You have, in many states, like ours, you have a state income tax, you also have a federal income tax, thanks to what amendment? 16th. Close. No cigar. Reserve powers. States have these powers: state welfare, local education control, local governments, professional licensing. Okay, these are things that the states have control of. The only way that the federal government really gets involved in there is to bribe the states with federal dollars, or to play a little game with the 14th Amendment and talk about due process and all that kind of stuff. All right, so keep this in mind on this. States have local, like, the federal government has nothing to do with deciding what a municipal division is in a state. States get to decide what their counties are, or their boroughs, or whatever they're using, parishes in Louisiana, and states get to decide the borders, boundaries of their cities, and what is a city, what is not. And in that system, the states have extreme power. For example, if the state of Oklahoma wants to make Midwest City and Del City become Mid-Del City, they can. All right? Well, I really don't want us to do that either, because everybody else in the country will just assume we don't know how to spell middle. Think about it. Mid-Del, it'd be M-I-D-D-E-L, right? They'd be like, why can't those people spell? That's what they would say. A lot of smart people have come out of Oklahoma, but a lot of people don't believe it because we talk slow.
We talk slow.
We talk slow. Go up northeast, they talk real fast, and they think that means they're smarter. Just makes Oklahomans think they're excitable. All right, here we go. So, reserve powers, we got that. Who shall rule in conflict? Where in the Constitution? Article 6, Supremacy Clause. Implied powers of national government upheld with. McCullough versus Maryland, established which clause? Okay, so some of these notes are kind of like, if you know them, they make sense. If you don't know about them, they go, what? Okay, so let me go through this guy's stream of consciousness notes here. What he's talking about here, Article 6, Supremacy Clause, is he's saying, hey, this is decided that where the federal government and the state governments share power and share the power to make laws, if they make laws, both of them make laws about it, and they conflict, the federal government wins because of the Supremacy Clause in Article 6. Okay? And that goes back to Gibbons versus Ogden, right? For example. And now implied powers, McCullough versus Maryland, that's where they're talking about the bank example I told you a slide or two back. So we have the implied power to have a national bank because of the expressed power of regulating interstate commerce and because of the necessary and proper / elastic clause. All right. So there you go. Look, I even anticipated it. And I know you're going to be shocked, but I didn't read the whole PowerPoint before I started. I just don't.
You're funky.
I know, horrible. And yet it seems to work. Okay, if not stated, states have the rights. Which amendment? 10th Amendment? Okay, so that's the reserve power amendment that I talked about before. Commerce power, court case Gibbons versus Ogden. I just mentioned that. Need to look that up. We got to probably move a little quicker. I realizing that we're going to be here a long time if I don't pick up on this stuff. Gibbons versus Ogden, that has to do with the supremacy clause, that has to do with the commerce clause, it has to do with steamboat licenses. The federal government had a steamboat license, the state of New York had a steamboat license. The New York steamboat license was a monopoly. A guy was using his federal license, the guy with the state license sued him, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, hey, a state license cannot overrule a federal license on something that the federal government has the power to make laws over. And so, guess what? Dude with the federal license got to sell stuff and got to use his steamboats. Full faith and credit clause. Full faith and credit clause has to do with the relationship between the states. One state's validity carries over to other state borders. If you get married in one state, it counts in another state, and that is why the whole same-sex marriage thing is such a dicey issue, because this really is going to get into the issue of federalism. When you have very conservative states and very liberal states and how they define marriage, it's going to be really interesting, because one question is if the most liberal state in the nation, can it make all the other states do things the way it wants to when it comes to this stuff? That's a really interesting question, and the Supreme Court has been trying its best to dodge directly answering that question. All right? Okay, from dual to cooperative federalism, education sets the stage for both the federal government and state governments to work together in fiscal harmony. So now we're going to understand dual federalism, cooperative federalism, and if somebody feels like using their phone to Google up and see if they can figure out what horizontal federalism is, because that popped up on a released exam, because I've never heard of that before. You know, you don't hear about vertical federalism. What's horizontal? Okay, this is the vertical. Do not adjust your set. Okay, that's outer limits. That's before your time. Hey, what were you saying?
It doesn't matter.
It does matter. Go ahead and say. I want to know. Inquiring minds want to know.
Okay, you said, that one state's validity, like, goes into others. So why do we have to, like, when you go to a different state, take your driving test? You know what I'm saying?
Oh, well, because that's a license. That's not a contract. When we're talking about full faith and credit, that's an excellent question, because if you're asking it, a bunch of other people don't understand that difference either. Okay? I understand the difference because I'm awesome. But here's the thing. It's just a joke. It's just a joke. All right. Full faith and credit clause has to do with contracts. Contracts have to be honored. If you move to another state, look, if you owe somebody $30,000 on a contract in Oklahoma, you can't just move to Texas and not pay it. Okay? And frankly, marriage is kind of it's kind of a business contract in a lot of ways. All right? It's got a lot to do with who has power over who and how the money is handled. All right?
I got it. Horizontal federalism.
Horizontal federalism. Go for it, Corbin.
It's the obligations of the state to each other.
The obligations of the states to each other.
Yeah.
So that has to do with what we're talking,
Yeah,
full faith and
okay.
credit clause. Horizontal federalism, a term not used in any of the textbooks I have ever read in my entire life. Okay, never. And that's one thing that I want to point out to you. Don't freak out if there's a question that just you completely blank on, because one thing, and I hope the AP people somehow end up seeing that, hearing this, they won't, but it'd be nice. They're kind of jerks. Because they will use any textbook anywhere and any big fancy political science textbook and use any term, period. And they're different terms for some of these things. And it would be very simple, and it would not be somehow wrong for them to make a huge long list of vocabulary terms and say, these are the terms we are using. Learn them. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with them saying, we're going to use the term expressed power as opposed to enumerated power or delegated. There's nothing wrong with that. But they don't do it. All right. Shared costs of fiscal federalism. Okay, so fiscal federalism. Here we go. This has to do with cooperative federalism. Remember in the old days, dual federalism. Guys, remember in dual federalism that the way it worked is, even if it was an area of policy they both had control over, say it was education, they would decide how to share the power in terms of, you do this, I do this. And then they would kind of ignore each other, the federal government and the state government. Okay, the whole idea behind dual federalism is they stay out of each other's way. They're not involved in the same policy issue. Okay? Cooperative federalism, yes, dual federalism is layer cake. Cooperative federalism, marble cake, which means the federal government's mixed up all in all those policy issues with the state. They are making decisions about the same questions. All right? And the way that the federal government gets to do that a lot of times is not because they have the express power to trump state power, but they use money as a leverage tool to get the states to do what they want. And that's where grants and aid and things like that come in. And grants and aid is basically, he says federal government sells land to fund programs. Well, the land giveaways were kind of before grants and aid. As I understand it, all grants are basically subsumed under, they're all part of the whole grants and aid concept. So let's talk about the two types of grants that really matter the most. Categorical grants
And block grants.
and block grants, yeah. Specific money for specific purposes. You have a project, there's lots of strings attached, there's lots of paperwork. It has to be non-discriminatory. It has cross-cutting requirements, and if a state doesn't follow the rules to a T to the categorical grant, they'll lose the money. And subcategories for that, project grants. Project grants is where states basically compete with each other to get the money. We're going to do it better than Texas. No, Texas is going to do it better than Kentucky. Whatever. That's how, they compete with each other. Some states got extra money because Obama liked the way they were handling education better than others. So that grant that he did there for educational performance a few years back, and I wish I could remember the name of it, that would be a project grant. Formula grants. This means, do you meet the formula? If your state has certain conditions, you get the grant. You don't have to compete with somebody else for it. If you meet those conditions, you get the grant. Okay, so that's what project grants and formula grants are. And those are tricky. So project grants you compete for, and I'll be honest, this guy explained that a lot better than I did. The way he put this on the slide made it easier for me to teach than I've ever been able to teach it before. I would have got it right on the test, but and it's so sad because it's not that complicated. It was just apparently a block on my brain. So project grants are competitive. Formula grants, you just have to meet requirements. Then you get to block grants. Okay, these are huge, big bundles of money with less strings attached over a given subject. Okay, so I don't know what he's getting at. SIGs pursue the $350 billion. Special interest groups or something, maybe, I guess, I don't know. But block grants, the simple academic way to say it is that this is where they decide education is not doing well, but instead of creating a categorical grant, they go to the states and say, hey, here's some money, spend it on education. If you think you need to spend it on teacher training, spend it on teacher training. If you think you need to spend it on textbooks, spend it on textbooks. If you think you need to spend it on building new school buildings and consolidating, do that. Whatever you want to do, just make sure you spend it on education and show us how you did it. As opposed to a categorical grant which would say, we think you need to improve education in your state by spending it on teacher training, and we've allotted you this much money to spend on it, and this is the paperwork you need to fill out to make sure that you can prove that you spent it the way we expect you to, and then we think this percentage of the money we gave you, you need to use to improve education by buying textbooks or what have you. And they'll have lots more conditions and a lot more control over how the money's spent. Mandates. These aren't grants, but they can be attached to grants. If the federal government tells the states that they've got to do something and they don't give them money, it's called an unfunded mandate. If they give them money, we just call it a mandate. For some reason, we don't fixate on the funded mandates. There are not a whole lot of funded mandates from my experience that anybody talks about anyway. But feds dictate specific guidelines. If you don't want to comply, they penalize you or you lose the funding. Okay? So some mandates. Special education. They've required states make an effort to differentiate instruction and provide facilities for students with disabilities. You know, that's why we have rooms where we have kids in here with wheelchairs and all sorts of stuff. And you know, it's kind of sad because we don't really see them too much. I'm glad we had our Special Olympics parade and all that kind of stuff, but there's really not that much contact, mainly because their instructional needs are so different from everybody else's in the buildings that we don't really mix too much, except for the kids who have classes where they help out with that stuff and everything, and that's really cool. I'm very proud, frankly, of the school because the kids do a real good job of treating those kids well. I've always been impressed with that, and it wasn't always that way. Your parents, if they're my age, and some of them are, we were not, as a group, as good about that as you guys have been. I'll just say that right now. Disability Act. Okay, this was a huge mandate where things like ramps had to be put in place so that you could go into restaurants with a wheelchair. And some people followed it to the letter, but just did it basically because they had to, and some people made a real effort. I can tell you there was a Pizza Hut that I took my Uncle Ray when he was in a wheelchair because of paralysis due to stroke, that had built a ramp that really was awful, and it was almost impossible to get him up that ramp. But you know, once you've had a relative that you've had to wheel around for a while and help in things, you really appreciate the Disability Act. And there was a time when I was alive that there was no Disability Act, okay? And a lot of things you guys take for granted, handicap parking, and all those ramps you're seeing at businesses and such, they didn't used to be there. And there used to be a lot more businesses where you had to very tight fits walking through the aisles, looking at their goods and so on. You know, that's another thing that they've tried to make sure. And you know, every city has an ordinance pretty much over that kind of stuff. Del City, you know, the lanes have to be so wide and so on to comply with the Disability Act. Clean air, which is, you know, dealt with emissions and factories and all that kind of stuff. Yes?
How would they penalize you for not using the money right?
How could they penalize you? Besides taking away? Wow, you had to go there.
Like, what can you do?
Jail. You can murder anything.
I guess we'd have to look at a specific law, a specific mandate to see what they would do. You know,
Chop your leg off.
well, I guess an example with how they would deal with certain things is perhaps take over some aspect of governance. You know, if for example a state refused to enforce desegregation, then federal troops would come in and enforce it. Right? Okay, so that's a cop-out easy example that I could come up with, but there you go. Hey, the easy examples are usually the ones that they use on AP exams, so that should make all of us very happy. And very sad when we miss those easy examples. All right, unfunded mandates, that is a problem, because one of the things the federal government has done is it's harder and harder for it to get money because all our competitors are no longer bombed out from World War II, and so it's harder for us to be awesome than it used to be. Sometimes they just say, hey, we don't have the money to get this done, we're going to make you do it, states. You figure out how to find the money. And one of the ways they've kept the tax base, the amount of taxation that goes to the federal government down, is they've just basically told the states to pay for stuff that, in the 60s probably the federal government would have picked up. Okay? So unfunded mandates. Unfunded mandates have a lot to do with the idea that we don't want more federal taxation going in, but we still want services. And the federal government's solution is make the states do it, and they find the money for it. Okay, so here's a practice essay to think about. The United States Constitution has endured for more than 2 centuries as the framework of government. However, the meaning of the Constitution has been changed both by formal and informal methods. Identify 2 formal methods for adding amendments to the Constitution. What?
By the House or Congress, 2/3 vote, and ratification of the state legislature.
Oh, so what we talked about just a little bit ago. Proposal by national legislature or convention, ratification by state legislature or convention. You know, and with the way they said this, you probably wouldn't have to give the fractions. Anybody know the fractions? 2/3, 3/4. All right. 2/3 national, 3/4 state. Describe 2 informal methods that have been used to change the meaning of the Constitution. Provide 1 specific example for each informal method you described. Ooh. What are informal methods?
Skip.
What?
I'll skip this one.
Judicial review. And if an example, an example of that would be Marbury versus Madison, or any other groundbreaking case, right? You could have used McCullough versus Maryland, or Gibbons versus Ogden, or some more recent stuff. What's another informal method?
What's that lady called?
Huh? Oh, kind of a political practice that becomes tradition. You know, this can happen in Congress. It can happen with the presidency. What's an example?
George Washington setting 2 terms.
George Washington setting 2 terms. Excellent. Explain why informal amendments are used more often than the formal amendment process.
They're easier.
Easier. Awesome. Okay, so House and Senate proposal with supermajority or special convention. State legislature confirms with 38 or a special convention, 3/4. And hey guys, it's always been national legislature to state legislature except for one amendment. What amendment changed it? It went to the state conventions instead of state legislature. It's the one where state legislators didn't want their name attached to that amendment. Repeal of prohibition. There's still a bunch of people who didn't like drinking, so those state legislators did not want to be on paper individually saying, yeah, I want booze back. They didn't want to be the guy who said that, so they put over these state conventions so it wouldn't affect them as much politically. Okay, so informal is easier, can happen daily, especially with court cases. Formal does provide more of a thorough legislative process, just not judicial whim. The U.S. has evolved from a system of dual federalism to a system of cooperative federalism. In the past 2 decades, some powers have devolved from the federal government to the state government. Identify and explain one factor that led to the national government having significantly more power than the states.
It's one factor.
Identify and explain one factor that led to cooperative federalism. Grants, mandates. Identify and explain one factor that led to devolution. Devolution. Giving the states more control over things like welfare policy. That's what devolution is.
Oh.
Okay, we're hurting on this one. What does that tell you guys? You better be
I
hitting.
don't know what devolution is.
Yeah, you might want to hit. Well, it's in your book, and I just described it.
I'm just kidding.
Here we go. Court rulings. McCullough versus Maryland. The elastic clause, necessary proper clause. States can't tax federal banks. States can't tax the federal government. That's one way. Grants and aid encourage states. Devolution. Medicare handouts, but they all come with conditions of aid. Debt load, more state right advocates. The TANF program was once a categorical grant, but now it is a block grant. TANF is temporary assistance for needy families. It's when you're saying welfare, you mean temporary assistance for needy families, and or you're using welfare more broadly for all of those services that, but welfare technically is temporary assistance for needy families. And it used to be called aid to families with dependent children. Under Bill Clinton, they redefined it to temporary assistance for needy families and gave states more control over it. So a lot of this devolution happened under Clinton, but also happened somewhat under Reagan and the Bushes. Although, this whole devolution thing has also been kind of contradicted by other federal decisions, right? There's more federal police power than there used to be. That's not devolution. Okay, political culture. Okay, so the things that affect political culture, tradition, customs, socialization, that is. That in socialization, political socialization, is all of that information that you take in as you grow up that develops your ideas about politics.
Is it family?
Family is the most powerful, absolutely.
And that would be
That's why the Tsarnaev brothers were like they were, even though they were surrounded by people who didn't think like they did about politics. All right? Because family is very powerful. And of course, families often are the ones who convey tradition and custom. If you're isolated from the rest of your community and your family is different, that's how you will get very different traditions and customs from everyone else. Events. We tolerated some new police powers at the federal level because of 9/11 that we otherwise wouldn't have. People changed their idea of what government should do during the Great Depression because of necessity, the sense that nothing else was working. So we have to let the federal government do things like the Works Progress Administration, the New Deal programs we never before would have been that open to do. All right? That's the argument that people make. Changes in the ways of political elites. There is a strong libertarian streak among really, really rich people in this country that didn't used to exist, as not to the degree it exists now. Okay? So that's one thing that has changed political socialization in this country. There's a lot more in the media. Here I am arguing elite theory to some extent. There's more attempt to influence media to report libertarian philosophies and ideas. All right? And there are little sneaky ways they do it. Like every high school student, for some reason, has the opportunity to write an essay, to get money, to compete for money for the Ayn Rand stuff. Okay? And that's been going on a long time. But that's not an accident. That it's not just because they want you to read important books and write essays. It's always her books, and it's always because she had libertarian ideas, and the people who want you to compete for that want you to be influenced by her libertarian ideas. All right? Sneaky, huh?
So if you write an essay that goes against their principles, you're never gonna get that. So
I don't know. I've always wondered if they're objective at all and how they award that. And I suspect they wouldn't be because, after all, they have an agenda behind always having those essays about her. Okay, her ideas. Family, school, relationships, as he says, as the paradigm shift. Your relationships and which relationships are important to you change over time. Peers have very little influence on your political views at a very young age. And frankly, peers don't have that much influence for most people because you are self-selecting. The people you hang out with, you tend to pick them because they have lots of points of agreement with you when you meet them. So they're not really changing your opinion about a lot of things. That's the way for a lot of people. Okay? Now, for me, that wasn't so much the case. A lot of the people I hung out with have very different opinions, but I'm one of those extremely extroverted, kind of self-assured people who kind of don't get swayed by other people too easily. I think some people call people like that obnoxious. All right, and here we go, moving on. Who establishes our political values? Who sets the agenda? SIGs. What is he talking about? Is that special interest groups? Right? Political institutions. Media, the new parent. Because of the idea that, kids spend more time watching TV than talking to mom and dad. Because mom and dad have created this kind of division where the kids just play.
It might be single issue interest.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah, single interest. I don't know. Whatever it is, it's annoying. Family.
I think that's
Family, okay. So, and agenda setting. Complicated. The policy agenda is a reflection of pressure put on it by the public agenda. And the people, remember the importance of the media in establishing what it is we're going to argue about. In other words, what the agenda is. The media has a lot of control over setting the agenda. However, they have very little control over how we think about the agenda. Because people tend to watch the types of media that are in their interests or their perceived interests. There are a lot of people who actually vote against their interests on a regular basis, but that's another story. But yeah, so if you are conservative, whatever the conservative media is saying about the agenda is what you already agree with, and that's what you're listening to anyway. If you're a liberal, you're listening to liberal media, and they're already agreeing with you on the agenda anyway. They're not really changing your mind about your view of the agenda. Okay? Occasionally something will happen that is not particularly political. And when I say that, I don't mean it's actually not political, but it's how we use the word, which means it's not controversial from a liberal to conservative kind of point of view. Everybody dislikes pedophiles. So when I was a kid and they started talking about child abuse all the time, because when I was in first and second grade, that was not in the news on a daily basis. Guys, when I was in second and third grade, I had more freedom of movement in my neighborhood than I had when I was in sixth grade, because all of a sudden the media set child abuse as an agenda issue. They started reporting about it constantly, and moms and dads across the country became absolutely frightened to death that there was some weird guy in a van who was going to come take their kid. All right? So that's an example of how the media can change the agenda. In that particular example, it wasn't a Democrat versus Republican kind of thing. Everybody said, yeah, let's do some things and pass some laws to make it harder for creeps to do bad things to kids. All right. Any questions about that?
SIGs means special interest groups.
Okay, so I was right. All right. Special interest groups, how can they help set the agenda? Who started talking about ethanol? Was it regular people saying, yay, let's put corn in our tanks? It was the corn growers. Corn growers. Okay? Missouri loves ethanol. Oklahoma, not so much. All right? But the corn growers have made that a federal issue very effectively, and that's a special interest group. And if you have a really old car, you don't like that because ethanol does bad things to old cars. And according to an Australian study, it does bad things to all cars. America's demographics. Who are we? Okay, demographics deals with gender, occupation, race, religion, social class. How do you determine demographics? With a census. We have a census every 10 years. That was established
Yeah.
very early on. How does the census and demographics affect us? Congressional apportionment, reapportionment. You know, which states have how many representatives? It wasn't too long ago that Oklahoma had 6 representatives. Now we have 5. And that's a big deal. Not only does it cut down on our votes in the House of Representatives, it also gives us one less electoral vote for picking the president.
Oh no.
Okay?
Oh no.
Yes. Yes. Not oh no, but yes. Uh-oh.
I guess it's
More of an uh-oh.
I guess
And why did that happen? Our population didn't decline. We just didn't grow as fast as the other states.
Our population stayed the same.
Yeah. We pretty well. Relatively speaking, there was a slight growth, but just not enough.
Not enough.
Yeah, because Florida and Texas are just blowing up. Arizona's blowing up.
Well, isn't that only bad for Republicans, seeing as this is a Republican state?
But Texas is a Republican state too. So, and Florida is other than certain sections of it, Florida may be moving toward Democrat. They're kind of iffy right now, but they were pretty strongly Republican there for a while. Hey! How does one determine demographics? Census, electoral college is affected by the census, so is, because congressional apportionment is, and electoral college is partly based on congressional apportionment. Redistricting is affected because you redistrict when you have population changes within a state. So if Oklahoma City gains population and Tulsa loses population, that means they're going to have to change districts.
Like school district?
No, districts for your congresspersons.
Oh, okay.
5th district, 4th district, 3rd district, 2nd district, 1st district.
Gotcha.
All right. Affects block grant distribution. Block grant distribution, is usually kind of adjusted by populations for states. So if your state has less population, you get less block grant money. Minority majority is influencing the great melting pot by 2050. Whites will be only 52% of society. Some people are projecting that whites will be a minority majority at that point.
Only 52%.
Oklahoma is more racially diverse than many states, and you have a skewed understanding of racial demographics if you only use our state as an example. All right? Guys, 12% of the population, a little over 12% of the population is African American. Around 14% of the population is Hispanic. In Oklahoma, the numbers are larger than that. All right? And I didn't bring up Asian Americans because it's a very small percentage of the overall population of America as a whole, but not of AP courses. There's a great deal of representation in AP courses by Asian Americans. All right. You draw your own conclusions. Who is the largest minority?
20%.
Hispanics. All right. Which is probably weirding out African Americans because African Americans have been the largest minority for a long time, and then 2000 happened. Okay?
I don't know what that means.
That's when Hispanics were officially, through the census, the largest minority.
Oh, okay.
All right?
I thought you were going to say, like, it was a huge,
So.
like,
It's going to get more complicated. As many, multiracial families we have and everything, and many people, we're having more and more people who don't identify as one or the other. So it's going to get interesting to see how that changes culture. What act requires employers to document the citizenship of employees or face fines? We read about it? Simpson-Mazzoli. Simpson-Mazzoli. How are we going to learn? How are we going to remember that? Ravioli? Is that how you're going to do it?
No, I'm not going to remember that.
I was trying to work off of something with the Simpsons, because when I see Simpson, I think about
Yellow people.
odd yellow people, yeah, who aren't very intelligent for the most part, even the ones who are supposedly smart. Lisa's supposedly smart, but she makes a lot of dumb decisions. For one thing, she doesn't run away and stay away from the rest of those crazy people.
What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Oh.
All right, so Simpson-Mazzoli, I don't know how you're going to make it work. I do know, Springfield is racially diverse, right?
Is it?
It has lots of yellow people. You don't see that too often.
You're doing the NP testing.
No, don't go there. This is going to be on YouTube. Don't do that. And that's kind of offensive nowadays. Whoa, wrong. I said it and I realized it could go there, and I was hoping nobody would do that. But you did.
Y'all make race jokes all the time.
Oh my gosh,
In the
what?
privacy of your own homes, y'all
What?
talking about races all the time, huh?
No, never.
I know y'all do.
I'm no Archie Bunker.
And stuff. Yellow people,
How has the shifting of America occurred? From Frost Belt to Sun Belt. Now, we're not talking about races here. We're talking about population shifts. So from the Frost Belt, basically from the north-northeast, that's where a lot of people have left. People are moving out of the north and northeast and moving south and southwest. Okay? So that's why Texas has grown dramatically. Look at that. 20% growth rates in places like Texas. 5% growth rates in the north. And how has this impacted the American political scene? There are more conservatives in the South, for one thing. And so that means that as reapportionment happens, and as there's more representation in states like Florida and Texas, that's going to change the political, balance between the parties. But then there's going to be something else that goes in to make it even more weird, which is the changing racial demographics, because minorities are increasing and they're more liberal. So even in the South is starting to liberalize a little bit. Ooh. Which means that some counties in the South are radicalizing, because they're like, oh, I'm surrounded by people who don't think like I do. I'm scared now and I'm going to be mean about it. That happens. Gray power. Baby boomers are graying rapidly. How's this going to impact the political landscape? A question I'm interested in is,
put a strain on Medicaid and
Medicaid, yeah, and it's going to put a strain on the workers, the working population, because the working population is not going to be as a large a percentage of the population. And how do the workers respond?
kill old people.
No.
Once they hit 80, it's time for them to go.
Okay, somebody's seen Logan's Run. All right. So,
I'm saying,
have you seen Logan's Run?
82?
I was like,
Oh,
let's
yes,
make
they
this
are.
It's the secret society. It's like after a Holocaust or apocalypse or whatever you want to call it. It's like this enclosed city, and when you get, what is it, 30, they kill you. And then this one guy his job was to go and kill people who tried to escape, who were at that age. He gets that age and he runs off with his girlfriend, and they try to get out of the city and go out into, the ruined North America, and they have an adventure. Logan's Run. They remade the movie a few years back.
I want to read that. Watch the movie. I want to read it.
Watch the really old one. Don't watch the new one.
Okay, is it on Netflix, you think?
Oh, I'm sure it is. It's cheesy as all get out, but
I think it's good.
for me, I like it because it's one of those things where you watch it because you remember liking it when you were 11, even though if you'd never seen it before, you would not like it now. Okay. Hey, they wish to collect their $5 trillion of Social Security benefits. Their special interest groups possess clout like the AARP, which is often rated number one among interest groups. It doesn't use its power quite the way most interest groups do, though, because it has a fairly narrow band of interest because a lot of its members on other issues besides money paying for things that old people use, they don't agree. There are lots of members in the AARP who are Democrats and lots of members in the AARP who are Republicans. So there are lots of issues that they don't agree on. But they tend to agree on Social Security and Medicare. Yeah, that's all right.
Hey, who is the baby boomers again? Are you a baby
D-
boomer?
No,
I can't remember. Sorry.
no, my dad's a baby boomer.
The people after World War II that got
Okay,
started
no, that's
doing
what it
the
was.
deal, and
That's
just
what it was.
No, if I remember correctly, I'm Generation X. And then something weird happened, which is the people 10 years younger than me, some people were calling Generation X, and I said, time out, they can't be the same generation. Hello. They like Nirvana and I don't. All right, so yeah, then they figured out one of us was Generation Y, and I don't know what you guys are. Well, then they're millennials, but you're I guess you're Z because you're before the millennials, right?
S for stupid.
You're right before the millennials.
Who's the millennial? The 2000?
Yeah, yeah. So you guys are what, Generation Y or Generation Z?
Generation freshman.
I don't care.
You just call ourselves the 90s.
You know what we could do is we could go by decade, and that would make life a lot simpler, wouldn't it?
That's what people always refer to as X.
Yeah, baby boomers are the people who were born after World War II. The years after World War II, when all these guys were coming back home and going, hey, I'm not distracted by killing now. Let's get married and have babies. Okay, that's what happened. And there was a boom. Lots of babies being born. Baby boomers. All right, how does one gauge America's pulse? With a blood pressure monitor? No, with polling. Early 1950s, George Gallup polled a microcosm of American political thought with a sample. The more random, the better. Everyone has a chance of being selected. You can have a bias sample. The classic example is how everybody thought that Truman was going to lose because they were doing telephone polls, right? And it's same thing with FDR. The polling they were doing was reaching people with more money who didn't like FDR and didn't like Truman. All right, so those are biased samples. If you're using telephones when most people don't have telephones,
That's
it's not going to work. That's biased. Absolutely. Now, if you're using regular telephones and not cell phones, that's some other kind of bias. Do poor people?
Yeah, that's.
Or maybe.
But yeah, I think at this point it would be, wouldn't it? It'd be easier to get a hold of old poor people than anybody else
I have a home.
with a landline.
We're not old.
Bad for people that still
I have a landline too, just in case the electricity goes out and can't charge my cell phone. Because the landline, sometimes, you can still use your landline when you don't have lights. Okay? It's kind of an emergency thing. Representative sample. Okay? Democrats use this, and that's not going to get tested over. Samples are not perfect. Sampling errors. There's a 1 to 5% error rate per 1 to 2,000 responses. The bigger the sample, the less the sampling error. All right? But it's really not going to get better than a margin of 3%. I've never seen a poll yet that said margin of error 1% or 2%. It's always 3 to 5%, somewhere in there. All right? So, and they're starting to argue that you can get below 1,000 now because of the techniques they use. You don't have to have 1,000 now. That's what they're saying, but the books have not updated to that. So I don't know about the AP. Well, yeah, but they say with modern technology they're able to do it right. I don't know. Random digit dialing speeds up the process, but again, it's more tricky now with cell phones.
Couldn't they do it by like IP address or something?
But some people don't have internet.
But people are
There's always gonna be a bias.
The-
If they
it-
go to people's houses, that's a bias.
I say census doesn't
It's always
raise,
a bias, it just depends on.
it's all gonna mess up all the
Heck,
time.
even today, there are people who don't have phones because they can't pay for them. And they don't get on that government program that recently the feds have gotten upset about because people have been abusing it. You know, SureTel and all those guys. All right, detect public preferences. What do you use polls for? To see how what people believe, what people want to do right this instant, like the gun control issue. A lot of gun control advocates were hoping there would be a big move on public opinion about that. There doesn't appear to be as big a push as they were hoping. Newtown didn't change things as much as they were hoping it would. Are there shifts in thinking, creating possible shifts in policy making? You're looking for changes sometimes. It's become the issue of selling policy instead of possibly doing what's right. That's an editorial on the part of that instructor. You know, people are afraid of politicians following the polls. But frankly, one thing that is true is that most people like the idea of some limits on who gets to use guns. Basically, we're cool with the idea of registration. The vast majority of people in the country, including a lot of people in Oklahoma, which might shock you, are cool with gun registration, but Congress still didn't do it. And why? Because of interest groups. So this idea that polling controls politicians is a bit simplistic. There's a lot of other things involved. Avoiding compromises to appease radical shifts. Politicians love polls when they agree with what they want to do. They hate polls when they disagree. There is a bandwagon effect. Some people, when they hear most people agree with something, suddenly decide they agree with it too. All right? Bandwagon effect. I think that may have a little bit to do with changing views on same-sex issues. Some people are genuinely changing their minds because of things they're seeing in the media and more reading on the subject. And then some people are doing it because, I guess that's where everybody's headed. I'll go with them. All right? What is an exit poll?
It's a poll where they ask you who you voted for.
Yeah.
They ask you who you voted for. Yeah, voters after they vote, what's wrong with them? They can control elections. The East votes earlier in presidential elections that if they report it, it can manipulate how people vote in the West. Possibly because of the bandwagon effect, possibly because people give up. My side's not going to win. I'm not even going to bother showing up. What is a push poll?
You force somebody to vote.
Opponent asks a negative question late in the campaign and the contender doesn't have time to respond. So it's a sneaky way to just basically slam your opponent. A push-pull is a loaded question. Example, classic example. So have you stopped beating your wife? Or your husband? You pick. Have you stopped beating your spouse yet? That's a loaded question.
Like, yeah.
Yes. Well, that means you used to beat your spouse, right? Or no, you're still beating your spouse. You can't win with that question. It's a loaded question.
I've never beat my wife ever.
For example, with this, you know how you can do a push poll like Sanford, who just won. You could say, how do you feel about the idea of a politician who runs off to another country with taxpayer, expenses to hang out with someone that they like more than their wife? That's a horrible push-pull question, really clumsy, but I'm just freestyling right this second. I'm sure I could write it better, but I'm not going to. All right, we're going to move on. Polls can show three things: relevancy or salience of a topic, and intensity, stability, and direction, positive. So you can show changes for something or against something. They can show whether that issue matters to people. They can show whether these opinions are holding true, whatever. So those are the things that polls can show. So it's important to recognize that just because people agree with something doesn't mean they're going to vote on it. Just because a lot of people want gun registration doesn't mean they're going to change who they vote for because Congress blocked it. Just doesn't. And notice, I didn't tell you whether I think gun registration is a good idea or not. I just reported facts. Take that. Liberals and conservatives disagree about the size of government. Liberals say big federal government. Conservatives say little federal government. Conservatives have gone a lot further nowadays. They want little state government and little local government as well. National, federal, big governments, centralized. Conservatives, small, state, decentralized. Liberals want things to change. They want more changes. Conservatives want the status quo. But this is a false distinction if you really study it, because usually the status quo that conservatives are pushing is a status quo that they think existed but didn't. Such as when I talked to you guys about how conservatives argue for original intent, but the reality is the Founding Fathers were not in agreement, and there are some things that conservatives believe that are true or were true in the past that really weren't. You know, for example, decades ago, it was a lot easier to get drugs, frankly, than it is now. No, I'm talking about legally.
Oh, okay.
And guess what? Drug abuse increased when it was easy to get back then, which is why they made it illegal. Okay? Magic. Who would think that if you make it legal to get drugs that people abuse, that they would use more of them? No, if we legalize drugs, people will use less of them. That's an interesting argument. I keep on hearing that argument. I keep on not believing it, but I keep on hearing it. Okay? International diplomacy. Okay, here's another difference. Liberals like to work with other countries' governments to get things done at an international level. Conservatives like the idea of America forging ahead on its own, or kind of telling other countries that are kind of semi-dependent on us to kind of go with us, or, you know, we'll just cut you loose. Kind of Liberals more of a touchy-feely diplomacy, and conservatives much more a hard-charging position. Now, an old conservative position is isolationist. Okay, so conservatives can be isolationists because that used to be the status quo, or they can be these America's the one superpower, we can get her done. You know, they go two ways, whereas really the big difference between liberals and conservatives on this issue is liberals want to talk it out with everybody else and get other countries to agree, or some countries to agree. Conservatives are like, we'll just do it our way. And if it makes people mad, oh well. View of man. Liberals think people can be fixed and cured. And conservatives feel that people, well, some people are just bad. And we need rules for those bad people. But conversely, people are good. That's why individualism is good. Basically, both of them have really muddled, confusing views that don't seem like they fit together. Okay? Both views are kind of, to me, incoherent. All right? Because liberals are all, you do whatever you want to in society, but you have to be nice to each other. You can be really self-destructive, but you have to be nice to other people. And conservatives seem to be, you don't have to be nice to other people, but you don't get to be self-destructive. Kind of, you know what I mean? It seems like it would be more like you can't be self-destructive and you have to be nice to each other, or you can be self-destructive and you don't have to be nice to anybody. And that last one I just gave you, that's libertarian. Libertarians are like, use drugs, commit suicide, whatever.
As long as you're content.
And you don't have to be nice to other people. You don't have any obligations to anybody else, right? Just don't mess with them.
Question.
Yes.
What's the in between? That's moderate, right? That's what you call it.
Yeah. Well, that's what moderates call it. A moderate will call themselves a moderate, and a conservative will call a moderate a liberal, and a liberal will call a moderate a conservative.
Okay.
So like when I used to get on political forums, it may be hard for you to believe this. For some strange reason, I didn't know how this was possible, but somehow I was a religious wacko and an atheist and a communist and a fascist. In the political forums I used to get on there because I was a moderate, which meant that all of the wackos hated me and put me in the other camp. Okay, all the real extreme conservatives thought I was a liberal, and all the extreme liberals thought I was a conservative. There you go. Use of violence to maintain order. Okay? Liberals want to just tweak things and try to talk people, get them over their issues of being bad. And conservatives want to smack them around a little bit in some real sense or metaphorical sense. Okay? Liberals more carrot, conservatives more stick. True liberals. Then you have the blue dog Democrats. Southern people who kind of supported the Democratic Party were more moderate on economics, but socially conservative. And then the Reagan era shift to the right happened. Clinton era shift to the left, into the middle. What? If he's talking about people, that's not what happened. Okay. I don't like how he's analyzed that issue. But okay. So Reagan, there was a shift there was a conservative shift in the country. Under Clinton, Clinton is an example of a Democrat who moved to the center. You know, in his political career, he started out as a fairly consistent liberal Democrat, and then at the national level, he ran as a moderate. And he worked with conservatives on some things. All right? And weirdly enough, when you have a president who's willing to act like a moderate and work with the other parties, wow, things can actually get done. Yeah.
Left liberalism and the right.
Left is liberal, right is conservative. It has to do with where the liberals and the conservatives were. Okay, it has to do with where the liberals and the conservatives were setting in the assembly in the French Revolution. All right, that's where the left and the right came from. But it makes it easy to remember that left L, liberal L, and then you know what the other side has to be.
Are Republicans.
Well, that's one way to do it, but
That's how Mr. Harris taught it.
That's how I think about it.
okay, that'll work somewhat. But remember, there's a difference between conservatives and Republicans, because there are third parties that don't view the Republicans as being conservative enough, like the Constitution Party. Okay? Or there used to be. I don't know what the Constitution Party is doing nowadays. I haven't heard from them in a long time. All right, here we go. When there's a shift in political thinking in the population, a significant shift, it's called realignment of political ideology. And that often usually involves a political realignment in the Congress about which party is in charge. Sometimes it doesn't, though. Political participation, the many forms, 8 ways to participate. You can vote. Remember, only 50% people vote. People who lack a sense of political efficacy don't vote.
I thought it was less than that.
You can join a special interest group. If you're old enough, you can join the AARP. If you like guns, you can join the NRA. If you are really worried about discrimination, you can join, the NAACP
I am in the NAACP.
or some other group that deals with that issue.
I really am in the NAACP.
Awesome. You can give money to special interest groups through PACs. You can become a political elite. You can get elected, I guess, is what they're getting. You can contact government officials on a regular basis. You can email them, you can phone them, you can annoy them. Good. You can work on a campaign. You can exercise civil disobedience, which we're all familiar with the civil rights movement. And violence,
I said we could be like Malcolm X.
which is illegal. The 8th option is illegal.
What's the
It is the option that was used in the American Revolution, by the way. All right. So who participates more? People who have more money participate more. People who have more education participate more. And people who are African American, and all things being equal, participate more than people who are white.